We're going to begin today, and actually, eventually, we will probably end today's lesson with a reading from Hebrews chapter 12. I'll read the first two verses. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. That was Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Thank you very much for joining us on Encouraging Words today. And our word is taken right out of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. It's going to be the word witness. And thank you, Andy, for joining us today and get us started.
Good evening. This text is one of those which, I don't know about you guys, gives me shivers of awe and excitement when I think about it. I'll leave to you, David, to talk about who these witnesses are, but let's define our word. It comes from the Greek word martus, which is where we get our English word martyr. However, our English word martyr has a narrower meaning and is used primarily of one who pays the ultimate price by giving his life for a cause. But the Greek word does not inherently carry with it that specificity. It simply means witness, and that thus it is translated that most often, meaning one who gives testimony to evidence which they have seen or experienced. The primary witness of the New Testament, as you see where this word occurs, is of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. That is how the word is most often used, but it's not the only witness that is talked about. In more general terms, we see that getting to the truth of a matter, for example, involves the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. You recognize that terminology from Jesus in Matthew chapter 18, or Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 5. It's also, this word witness is also used of those who have heard the testimony of Jesus' apostles. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2 seems to be an example of that. It is used of 2 Christians who gave their lives for the faith and are therefore called witnesses. Stephen, of course, we're probably most familiar with, and it's actually Paul, in recounting his past life and involvement with Stephen's death, that uses the term witness or martyr, as we sometimes translate it, in Acts chapter 22 and verse 20, as he's giving a recounting of his own conversion and his past before his conversion. And then the other one is a man named Antipas, who we don't know much about, but is a member of the church in Pergamum and is referred to in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 13. And so while many may not think of dying for their faith to be encouraging, consider the strength of faith of those who are ready and willing to do so, and ask ourselves, is that us? And if not, we need to find courage. That is, be encouraged by these examples of faith.
Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping that we'll do today. The verse I just read in Hebrews 12 and verse 1 begins with the word therefore, and it appears to be pointing to the people who are mentioned in chapter 11. And chapter 11 is sometimes called the heroes of faith. And it's as though we're running a spiritual race there in verses 1 and 2 of Hebrews chapter 12, and in this life. And the people of chapter 11 are our mentors and our examples, and are surrounded us as this cloud of witnesses cheering us on. Or really, they're testifying to the fact that though it's difficult at times, and we're going to see that in their lives, there's a lot of difficulty in the lives of each one of these that are mentioned. That it's a race that requires endurance. Verse 1 already mentions, but it can be done. And it's worth it to maintain our faith at all costs and in all situations. And I mean that literally.
Mhm.
Andy, I thought we'd quickly run through some of the people that are mentioned in Hebrews 11. We're not going to have a chance to talk about them in detail. A lot of them are well-known stories in the Bible. And I would like for us to see, okay, if they're witnesses, what's their testimony to us? Okay, they're surrounding us until they're tapping us on the shoulder or they're in the stands cheering us on. They're not just saying go, go, go. Their lives are saying something about our endurance, and so I would like for us to try to draw a few of those out. And Andy, why don't you begin with Abel and Hebrews, go back up to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4.
Sure. Yeah, by faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks. So Abel teaches us that excellent faith and sacrifice sometimes involves even the ultimate sacrifice. Um, Interestingly, here we are told not that Abel was a witness, but that God
Right.
witnessed. God took note of Abel's faith and corresponding sacrificial gifts. And thus, even now being dead, Abel still speaks because God has preserved his record and has held him up as an example and has thereby testified. God has testified to us an example of the kind of faith that he values. So he's holding up these examples to us. This is what I'm looking for from people. These are the ones whose faith is counted as righteousness. And indeed, the remainder of the examples cited in chapter 11 here help us to understand the attitudes and behaviors which accompany those who are in that cloud of witnesses. And Abel tells us faith that is willing to lay down one's life is one of those characteristics.
Right, and it's worth it.
Worth it.
You're running a
Absolutely
race,
worth
and this is going to kill me. This is going to kill me. And somebody goes, he goes, well, I'm just telling you, even if it does kill you, it's going to be worth it. We don't have
Right.
very many races in this life where that would be worth it.
Right.
But Abel is saying this spiritual race really is worth it. Enoch is an interesting one to be mentioned next in chapter 11 of Hebrews in verse 5, because by faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death. And so we got one person who died, and we got another person who didn't die, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had the testimony. Again, interestingly enough, God testifying again, just like with Abel, that he pleased God. So we've got the testimony of somebody who's testifying to us. It's almost as though God is saying, yeah, what that guy is saying is right. God himself saying that this is an example that you need to follow. There's a couple of interesting things here. The first one that occurred to me with Enoch is he was taken away at relatively, for that time, a young age. We wouldn't think of it as a young age, but he was a relatively young age. We go, he was cut down, he was disappeared, whatever, however it happened, and at the prime of life. Well, no, wait a minute, there's something better. There's something way better than living in this life, and we've got to get that in our heads, because sometimes we are looking at life from the wrong perspective. Being with God is way better than anything that we can experience in this life. And then the second thing, in contrast to Abel, we need to be willing to die for our faith, but or to do what's right. But ultimately, Enoch is testifying that if we really want to overcome death, then we need to trust God and live righteously. So the ultimate overcoming of death is through God. It's not through Botox and exercise and dyeing your hair or vitamins. Ultimately, it is going to be through God. No, we're not going to experience the being taken and not dying, most of us, although some of us could be alive when the Lord comes, which would be something similar. But but what he's saying here is that ultimately life is in God.
And it's interesting that he concludes that case with Enoch by calling him the friend of God.
Right.
And again, this is God's witnessing, God's testifying of these examples. You want to be a friend, you want to be God's friend, then you need to have a faith like Abel. You need to have a faith like Enoch. And that's what we all know, verse 6. Without faith, it's impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And so these people are manifesting what God is looking for. These are not perfect people. They are very imperfect people if we look deeply into their lives, if we're told much about them at all. Noah, we know, had his flaws, but in verse 7, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So Noah's obedient actions in building the ark per the instructions of God were a kind of testimony of his faith in unseen things like worldwide floods. And at the same time, it was a testimony against something, against the wicked and ungodly culture in which he was presently living. So we need to realize that by positively doing what God has called us to do, which may be very countercultural, we too are proclaimers of righteousness and are thereby having an impact on our children, over whom we have the most influence, and their destiny, while at the very same time, with the same actions and same beliefs, same words, at the same time condemning a world that needs desperately to change its ways, or it will face God's judgment. So this witness or this testimony is to both those that are trying to do what's right and those who need to do what's right.
Yeah, in the race of faith, there's a lot of people who cramp up when they have to tell somebody they're wrong, or when they have to take a stand against the government, and they have to go sit down on the side, or maybe let someone else try to run the race. And Noah is saying, no. We're all cheering Noah. What a great guy, and they sing the songs about good old Noah building the ark. And we're so encouraged by that there was this historical figure who took a stand. And then when our opportunity comes, we say, I don't think God would want me to condemn somebody or condemn the world or be so different. And Noah's standing on the sidelines going, oh, don't sit down. You got to do this. And by the way, there's going to be times when we don't know what's going on. We don't know why God wants us to do it, why God puts us in this position at this time, in this place. It seems like it's not going to be helpful. Abraham is mentioned in Hebrews 11, verses 8, 9, and 10. I'm not going to read it, but the case where he was told to leave his home. He went out, verse 8 says, not knowing where he was going. He went. He didn't even own the land. He just dwelt in tents. He waited for the city, which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God, verse 10. And so sometimes we struggle because we can't see how what God tells me to do is going to work out. I want to know all the details. I want to know where I'm going. I want to know what he's doing. And he's asking me to trust him in faith that it's going to work out. Abraham went not knowing where he was going. He just knew that God was going to provide. He trusted in him. And when we're running our race and there are some questions about why does he want me to do this? I don't get it. I see in scripture that it's the right thing to do and everything, but I can't understand where this is taking me, how this is going to work out. I just can't see this. It's going to work out the right way. Abraham is shouting as this witness. His testimony is, you go. And it will work out. God will keep his promise.
Yeah, your imagery of cramping up just tickled me. I didn't see that coming, and that's so true, though, that you can imagine those who have run the race before seeing the things that we cramp up with, and we need a little bit more training, don't we? The next one we look at in Hebrews 11 is Abraham's wife, Sarah. And I think a lot of people sometimes question her being included here, especially what is cited. But I think what we're being told here is that by faith, we can testify that with God, all things are possible. And we might be scratching our head, though, with Sarah thinking, well, this praise of Sarah is a little odd in view of the fact that the Genesis story has her actually laughing at the prospect of God doing the impossible, or what was thought to be the impossible, of having a child in her old age. Maybe there's a different way to look at that. These people of faith, as we've already made reference to, weren't perfect. They had their spiritual ups and downs, and don't we? We do. And so while we negatively remember Sarah's doubts and her laughing, what's significant to me is God remembers her faith. And recall that Abraham also laughed at the announcement, but for some reason, he remains the exemplar of faith despite his laughter. But with Sarah, we focus in on her laughing, and God doesn't. He doesn't focus in on her laughing. He focuses on her faith. And isn't that what we want God to do with us? Not focus in on our faults and our flaws and our failures, but to focus in on our faith. So can we not conclude that once Sarah was called out for her faithless laughter, and you'll recall she was kind of laughing in the background behind the tent flap or something like that, away from these mysterious men who had come to her, and she's called out on it. Well, how in the world did he know she was laughing? And then she believed. Can't we just picture how humbling and how sobering that would have been, that she was called out for her faithlessness and that it made her actually stronger? How many of us have been convicted by our faithlessness in the past and thereby encouraged to greater faithfulness in the future? So I'm reminded of something that somebody said to Jesus: Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.
Right. And so how many of us in our race are tempted to give up when somebody, points out a failure or a lack of faith in us, a place where we need to get stronger, how we need to exercise, how we could do it better. And we're like, oh. But Sarah, great example of somebody who, even though there was something that seemed impossible, it seems like she doubted at first, or it was too good to be true, maybe. That's where she was, and yet here she is. Obviously, her heart was changed. We need to do the same in our race. Next step in Hebrews 11, 17, 18, and 19 is the well-known story of where Abraham was called to offer up his only begotten son. Verse 17 calls him, even though God had said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. What's going on here? I'm going to kill him. Verse 19, he concluded, I guess God's going to raise him from the dead. He never saw anybody raise from the dead, but obviously God can raise the dead. Where do you learn that? Well, because God is God. So when God calls on somebody for extreme sacrifice, and by the way, when we're running our race, sometimes we'll say, well, nobody else has to do that. I have to give that up, or, I have to, it seems like everybody's telling me I'm wrong. How come we're not telling the other people that they're wrong? Or how come I have to do the extreme sacrifice? Or how come I always am called on to do something? And Abraham's saying, that's right. That's right. Sometimes we're called on to do things that other people don't have to do. No, where's anybody else besides God, by the way, and God was working here, have to sacrifice their own son. There's a lot of lessons in there for us too, in what we sacrifice. But one of the big ones here is that when extreme sacrifice is being called on, even though it may not be exactly the same as Abraham, Abraham's saying, yep, you can do that. And you might say, I don't think God would want me to have to make that big a sacrifice, maybe never marry or live without kids. It's always, or to lose my job, or have to move someplace so I could be closer to the brethren or something, and make some radical change in my life. I just don't think that God would ask me to make such a big sacrifice. And Abraham saying, "Don't sit down, don't stop the race, keep going, keep going." No, run the race with endurance. Chapter 12, verse 1 is going to say, and these are endurance kind of things.
Yeah, and that story has always intrigued me, that account there, because here he's being put forward as an example of faith, but he was wrong about how God was going to accomplish this. He knew God would accomplish whatever he meant to accomplish, but he was wrong in the particulars. And sometimes I think we got to know all the particulars just right. No, we don't. Faith believes in unseen things, and sometimes in our lack of seeing, we get exactly how it's going to be carried out wrong, but we still have faith in God. Mm-hmm. He goes on then to talk about all the other patriarchs: Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. In quick succession, we're given some snippets of faith in these patriarchal descendants of Abraham. The story of Isaac's blessings upon Jacob and Esau is often viewed very negatively, but without justifying Jacob's deceptive ways, the narrative helps us to see that Isaac had faith in the blessings that he was giving to his sons, that he was inspired to give his sons, and he stuck with them, even though he knew he had been deceived. He intended that one for another son, but he knew God had another plan, and so he just stuck with them. It was God's will, even if it was not his will, and to that he was faithful. And in the end, Jacob likewise gave blessing to his sons and grandsons. And the leaning on his staff thing is kind of interesting. It's possibly a reference to when he rallied himself in bed to bless Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and did so in a very unconventional way. And all of his blessings to his sons were a demonstration of his faith in God's promises and plans, even as he died in Egypt, which he probably didn't picture himself doing until it got right down to the end there. Likewise, Joseph, very similar to his father, when dying, by faith, gave instructions concerning his bones. This was less about concern for his mortal body or his literal bones, and more symbolic about his faith in God's promises and plans regarding the children of Israel obtaining the promised land someday. And so think about it. May we all die testifying of our own faith in the promises and plans of God, so as to encourage the generations who will bury us.
Yeah, we're running out of time really quickly. And Andy, you and I probably should have chopped this in half and done two of them. But because we've got Moses' parents in chapter 11 and verse 23, who I guess we could say stood up to the government. When they made a law that was unjust and required them to kill their children, didn't do that. And also, what's one kid? They're little things make a big difference. We have a Moses, which, by the way, the next quite a few verses here, 10 verses or so, are going to talk about Moses. We wouldn't know if it wasn't for the faith of, and sometimes parents have to take a pretty tough stand and take quite a beating from others because they're taking a stand for the good of their children.
Yeah, and then Moses found himself in the lap of luxury and in a position of power and influence, and that he sacrificed all of that in order to suffer with the oppressed, is the way that it puts it there in verses 24 through 27. So anyone watching this on their own devices, what we're doing tonight, likely finds themselves in a similar position relative to the otherwise poor and oppressed in this world. Moses' willingness to do this was a witness to the fact that he, as Jesus Christ ultimately demonstrated, valued the reproach of this world for doing God's will greater than all that this world has to offer. How did he do that? Well, it says he looked to the reward. He saw him who is invisible. You can only do that with faith. And so for all his reluctance and other flaws and failings, Moses saw the promised land from a distance, and the God who promised it all, he saw even clearer and so much more.
Yeah. And the next two, and talking about Moses and talking about Jericho and Rahab, are about, we'll let you read those on your own, 28 through 31. The trusting God for deliverance. You get a feeling in Hebrews in this last section that that the Hebrew Christians were going to have to endure some things, and we're going to have to look beyond that. Considering verse 3 of chapter 12, him who endured hostility from sinners. And I think they're going to experience some of the same. We're going to experience some of the same. Moses trusting God for the deliverance through the Exodus. Rahab, who put faith in God. Is a very complicated story to kind of wrap your head around, but she it was a person of faith who not only trusted God, but is an example of somebody who acted on her faith when surely that would have been wildly countercultural and seen as treasonous,
Yes.
and yet she reached out to that. And then starting in verse 32, he says, "And what more shall I say, for the time will fail me," just like our time is failing us here. And he starts listing people, Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. There's too many. And then he just starts listing various things that people did, wild things like subduing kingdoms and stopping the mouths of lions and escaping the edge of the sword. And some people were raised to life again. Some people died and experienced all kinds of cruel and torturous.
Sonnet 2.
What?
Sonnet 2.
That one always stands out. We gotta say that one. Imprisonment and stonings and all kinds of things. And it says the world isn't worthy of them. And by the way, those people are there too. They're sitting on the sidelines now, having run their race, and they're saying you can do it. So we're not supposed to just be awed. They're not just a museum where we go, oh, that's incredible. Oh,
Right.
isn't that wonderful? Oh, I wish I could be like that. What they're saying is you can be. That's what they're testifying.
Yeah. And then the chapter ends there, verse 39. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. So all these, named and unnamed, obtained a good testimony, good witness through their faith. Just as with Abel, it is God who observed their faith and testifies to us through the scriptures of the kind of faith that he counts as righteousness. It is the kind of faith that sacrifices all, even if not experiencing the benefits of the promise in the present. Indeed, God's ultimate promise was not a baby, a child, a physical nation, a geographical land. It was and is being recreated and perfected by God's grace as revealed and fulfilled in Jesus Christ's incarnation, in his crucifixion, in his resurrection, and his ascension. That's the gospel. And through it, everyone of faith, from Abel to the present, are justified and perfected through Jesus. We were talking ahead of time about this race imagery. And David, you mentioned the idea that it's like they didn't get their reward. They're waiting on their reward till we all finish running the race. We're all perfected together in Jesus Christ. He is the one through whom we our faith is established, and God testifies using these examples to us of what kind of faith he's looking for in each of us.
Our eyes on him, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And the voices we hear around us are those who have run the race, waiting to be rewarded with us. Thank you very much for studying with us. Witnesses, our encouraging word today, and you can be encouraged by them, whatever your life situation, to keep the faith and run the race. Thanks for studying with us today.